The gate latch was frozen solid. Hester Boone had been standing at it for nearly 3 minutes, her fingers so numb she could no longer feel the iron beneath her gloves, could no longer tell where the metal ended and her skin began. The wind off the Montana plains was the kind that did not simply blow, it cut, deliberate and precise, like a man who knew exactly where to put the knife. She had walked 4 miles in it. She had walked 4 miles in the dark, in the snow, in the kind of cold that made the trees crack open at the trunk like rifle shots, and she had arrived at this gate, at this fence line, at the edge of this man's property, with nothing but a carpetbag that held one dress, a photograph, $43.11, and a secret so heavy it had bent her spine. She did not know Robert Alden. She knew of him the way you know of weather before it arrives, the way people in Caldwell Creek spoke his name in lowered voices, with something adjacent to reverence and something adjacent to fear. She knew he had land. She knew he had cattle. She knew his wife had been dead for 7 years, and that in those 7 years he had spoken to almost no one by choice. What she did not know was whether he would open his door. What she did not know was whether she would survive if he didn't. She tried the latch again. This time something gave ice cracking, iron shrieking, and the gate swung inward, and Hester Boone stepped onto the property of a man she had no right to approach, carrying a secret that could get her killed, on the coldest night of the year in the winter of 1884. The farmhouse was 50 yards from the gate. Light burned in one window, orange and steady, the kind of light that means someone is awake and tending to something, or perhaps just unable to sleep. Her boots broke through the top layer of snow with every step, the crust sharp enough to nick leather. She reached the porch steps. She climbed them. She raised her fist to the door. She knocked 3 times. There was a long silence, long enough that she began to wonder if she had imagined the light. Long enough that the cold moved past her coat and into her chest and settled there like a second heartbeat, one that was slower, slower, threatening to stop. And then she heard footsteps, deliberate, unhurried, the footsteps of a man who was not afraid of whatever was on the other side of his door, or who had simply stopped being afraid of things in general, and the door opened. He was taller than she'd expected, dark-haired, with a beard grown past the point of grooming, wearing a flannel shirt with the sleeves rolled to the elbows despite the cold seeping through the open door, his eyes the particular gray-green of a river right before a storm. He held a lantern in one hand and looked at her without surprise, which surprised her more than anything else about him. He looked at her face. He looked at the carpetbag in her hand. He looked at the way she was shaking, the way her lips had gone the color of a bruise. He did not ask who she was. He did not ask what she wanted. He did not ask how she came to be standing on his porch at 10 o'clock on the coldest night in recent memory. He simply stepped aside and said, "Come in." And then he built a fire. 3 weeks earlier, Hester Boone had been someone else entirely. Or perhaps more accurately, she had been the same woman in a different trap, with different walls and a different captor, and it had taken losing everything to understand that some cages only look like homes. She had arrived in Caldwell Creek, Montana Territory, in October of 1884, answering an advertisement placed in the Chicago Daily Tribune by a rancher named Dale Boone, who was seeking a wife of good character and sound constitution. She had been 31 years old, recently widowed from a marriage that had been neither kind nor terrible, simply airless, a marriage to a pharmacist in Illinois who had died of a fever in August and left her with $600 in debt, and the particular social humiliation of being a woman alone with no children, no family, and no obvious future. She had answered 3 advertisements. Dale Boone had responded first with a letter that was grammatically imperfect but emotionally direct. He had written, "I'm not a romantic man and I won't pretend otherwise, but I work hard and I don't drink and the house is sound and the land is good. I need a partner. I can offer honest labor and honest company." She had thought, that is more than most men offer. She had come. Dale Boone was 53 years old, which the advertisement had not mentioned. He was not unkind exactly in the first weeks. He was simply present in the way that furniture is present, always there, immovable, taking up space without contributing warmth. He told her where things were kept. He told her what was expected. He did not once ask her what she wanted or needed or hoped for, and she understood with a steady, quiet despair that she had traded one airless room for another, slightly larger one. But it was in the third week that she discovered what Dale Boone had not put in his letter. He owed money, a great deal of it. Not to a bank, which would have been manageable, but to a man named Vernon Creel, who operated out of the town of Harker's Bluff, 40 miles south, and who had the particular combination of cruelty and patience that makes a dangerous man more dangerous than a merely violent one. Vernon Creel had lent Dale Boone money to expand his cattle operation 4 years ago, and Dale had been paying it back poorly, in small amounts at irregular intervals, and now the full weight of that debt had come due. Hester found out about this not because Dale told her, but because she found the letters. A stack of them, hidden beneath a loose board in the bedroom floor, the handwriting on the envelopes precise and cold, the return address a post office box in Harker's Bluff. She had not intended to read them. She had been looking for a missing boot button that had rolled under the bed, and her fingers had found the edge of the loose board, and something in her, something that had been surviving on instinct for 31 years, had told her to lift it. She read every letter. By the time she finished the last one, she understood 3 things clearly. First, Dale owed Vernon Creel $1,100. Second, Creel had written in his most recent letter that if the money was not repaid in full by December the 1st, he would take everything, the land, the cattle, the house, and that he would take other compensation as well, in whatever form seemed appropriate. The phrase other compensation was underlined twice. Third, she was now part of Dale Boone's assets, whether either of them had intended it or not. She replaced the letters. She replaced the board. She spent the next 2 days moving through the house like a ghost, doing her work, cooking and cleaning and mending, while her mind worked at the problem the way water works at stone, steadily, without drama, with the understanding that this was going to take time but that it would eventually give way. And then Dale Boone died, not by violence, not by Creel's hand, not yet, not directly. He died on a Tuesday afternoon in late November, alone in the far pasture, of what the doctor from Caldwell Creek diagnosed as a cardiac event. He was simply here and then he was not, and Hester stood beside his grave in the frozen ground of the ranch he had barely let her think of as hers, and understood with a terrible clarity that his death had not solved her problem. It had made it infinitely worse, because Dale's death meant the land went to debt first. It meant Vernon Creel would hear about it within days. There were men in Caldwell Creek who kept ears to the ground for exactly this kind of news, men who fed information to Creel the way other men fed chickens, regularly and without much thought. It meant that when Creel came, and he would come, there would be no husband standing between her and whatever other compensation he had in mind. There would only be her, a widow, alone on a ranch that was already being swallowed by debt, with no legal standing to fight what was coming. She had exactly one option that she could see, and it was not a good one. But it was the only one she had. She packed the carpet bag. She waited until the darkest part of the night. She left. She had walked the first mile on the road toward Caldwell Creek before she understood that going into town was no safer than staying on the ranch. Creel would look for her there first, and the town had no particular love for her. She was new, she was a widow, she was a stranger. She needed to get beyond the town, beyond the reach of Creel's immediate network, and she needed shelter, because the temperature had been dropping all evening with the specific and merciless intention of the Montana winter, and she was already cold in a way that worried her. She had heard the name Robert Alden twice in her weeks in Caldwell Creek. Once from the general store owner, a man named Hollies, who had mentioned that Alden's North Range bordered the road she'd need to take if she was going to get to the junction at 3 Pines, which was the only point from which a stage ran north. and once from the woman at the laundry, a quiet Crow woman named Me who washed the linens for half the town and who had said, when Hester mentioned she felt unsafe on the Boone ranch, "The Alden man is decent. He kept 3 families through the blizzard of '81. He does not turn people away. He does not turn people away." She had held on to those words for 3 weeks, and in the end they were the only compass she had. The fire Robert Alden built that night was not a small, courtesy fire. It was a real fire, built with the calm efficiency of a man who understood that warmth was not a luxury but a survival mechanism, who stacked the wood with the same deliberateness he brought to everything else, who coaxed the kindling with a patience that seemed almost out of place in a man who said so little. Hester sat in the chair nearest the fireplace, the carpet bag at her feet, and let the heat work its way back into her fingers and her face and the center of her chest, and she watched him. He moved without wasted motion. He did not look at her while he worked, or rather he did not stare, but she had the sense that he was acutely aware of her, not in a threatening way, but in the way that a person who has spent years largely alone becomes sensitively attuned to any presence in their space. He was perhaps 40, perhaps a few years past it. There was a steadiness to him that read, depending on the light, as either profound peace or profound sadness, and she suspected it was some combination of both. When the fire was properly established, crackling and certain, he went to the kitchen. She heard the sound of a pot being filled, water running from a pump, the clank of metal on the iron stove. He came back with a tin cup of something that turned out to be coffee, and then a few minutes later he came back again with a bowl of beans that had clearly been kept warm on the stove, the kind of beans that had been cooking since midday, seasoned with something smoky that she couldn't immediately identify. He set them on the small table beside her chair. He pulled a second chair to the other side of the fire and sat down in it. He folded his hands and looked at the fire for a long moment. Then he said, "You don't have to tell me anything tonight." Hester, who had been preparing a careful explanation, a story that was true but not complete, a version of events that would explain her presence without revealing the full weight of her predicament, felt something shift in her chest at those words. It was not relief exactly. It was more like the feeling of having braced for an impact that didn't come, the sudden strange ache of unused preparation. "That's a generous position," she said finally. "It's a practical one," he said. "You're not going to freeze. That's the only important thing tonight." She looked at him then, really looked, and he let her, meeting her eyes without aggression or demand, without the particular performing quality that men sometimes had when they wanted a woman to find them trustworthy. He simply looked back, gray-green and steady, and she thought, either this man is exactly what he appears to be, or he is the most accomplished deceiver she had ever met, and there was only one way to find out which. She ate the beans. She drank the coffee. She let the fire do its work. He showed her to a small room off the main hall, spare, clean, a rope bed with a quilt that she later learned had been made by his mother, a woman who had died in 1876 in a farmhouse in Ohio before ever seeing Montana. There was a washstand with a ceramic basin and a pitcher of water he'd already set out, and a hook on the door for her coat, and a small window that looked out at nothing but darkness and snow. "The door locks," he said. She understood that he was telling her this not because he thought she should be afraid of him, but because he wanted her to know that she had control over this particular thing, that in whatever difficult situation had brought her to his gate, this door, this lock was hers. "Thank you," she said. "Good night, Mrs. Boone," she said. "Hester Boone." He nodded. "Robert Alden." And then he went back down the hall, and she heard him settle into the main room again, and she heard the fire, and she locked the door and lay down on top of the quilt with her coat still on because she was still not fully warm, and she fell asleep faster than she had expected, in a stranger's house on the coldest night of the year, without having any clear idea of what the morning would bring. The morning brought snow. Heavy, relentless, the kind that made the windows look painted white and reduced the world to what you could see from the porch, which was not much. Hester woke to the smell of coffee and something frying and found Robert Alden already at the stove, and this struck her as remarkable. A man who cooked for himself, who did not wait for a woman to do it, who had simply gotten up and made breakfast as though it were the most ordinary thing in the world to have a stranger in his house and to feed her. She stood in the doorway of the kitchen in her dress from the carpet bag, the navy blue wool, her second best, now her best, and said, "I can do that." "Sit down," he said, not unkindly. "You haven't got your warmth back yet, I can tell." She sat down. He made eggs from the hens he kept in a small coop attached to the barn, and biscuits that were not fancy but were solid and reliable in the way of things made by a person who has made them many times. And he poured coffee from a pot that had been sitting long enough to be strong, and they ate at the small kitchen table with the snow pressing against the windows. "I need to tell you why I'm here," she said, after the first several minutes of eating in a silence that was not uncomfortable but was clearly temporary. "You don't owe me an explanation," he said. "I know I don't," she said. "But I owe you the truth, because the situation I'm in may create problems that extend to you, and you should know that before you make any decisions about my being here." He set down his fork. He looked at her with the focused attention of a man who did not multitask, who, when he listened, actually listened. She told him everything. She told him about the advertisement and Dale Boone and the marriage that had been transactional and heirless. She told him about the letters under the floorboard, about Vernon Creel, about the debt, and the phrase "other compensation" underlined twice. She told him about Dale's death and how it had left her not liberated but more vulnerable, because a dead husband provides no protection and a widow with no rights to the land is simply a woman alone with a target on her back. She told him she had walked 4 miles in the dark and the cold because it was the only move she had left to make. When she finished, there was a silence. He looked at the table for a moment, then back at her. "How much time do you think you have?" he asked. "Before Creel sends someone." The question was so practical, so immediately focused on the relevant fact rather than on his own feelings about the situation, that she felt a sudden, startling gratitude. "A week," she said, "maybe less. He'll hear about Dale's death through the county and he'll want to move quickly on the land before any legal process can slow him down." Robert Alden nodded. He picked up his fork and resumed eating. "You'll stay here," he said. "Mr. Alden, the storm will keep you here for at least 2 days regardless," he said. "After that we can discuss what makes sense. But you are not going out in this, and you are not going back to a ranch that belongs to Creel's debt collectors, and you are not going into Caldwell Creek where he has eyes." He paused. "You said you had some money. $43. That's enough for the stage north if we can get you to 3 Pines. But we need to think about whether that's actually the safest option, or whether it just moves the problem to a different location." He looked at her steadily. "Creel, Vernon Creel, what do you know about him beyond the letters?" She told him what she'd gathered from the townspeople, from the oblique references and lowered voices, and the particular way people stopped talking when certain subjects came too close. Vernon Creel was 45 or 50, she thought. He had come to Harker's Bluff about 10 years ago from somewhere in Texas, and in those 10 years he had built what appeared to be a legitimate lending operation, but was in practice something closer to a system of controlled debt. He lent money to ranchers and farmers at reasonable rates, then found ways to ensure they could not fully repay, until the debt reached a point where the land itself was the only currency left. He had acquired 6 properties in 4 years this way. He had a lawyer in Harker's Bluff, named Simmons, who kept everything technically legal. He had 4 or 5 men who worked for him who were not exactly employees in any formal sense but who appeared wherever Creel needed something done that required presence and intimidation rather than legal paperwork. Robert listened to all of this without interrupting. When she finished, he said, "I know the name. He tried to approach 2 ranchers on the eastern side of the creek 3 years ago. Neither one took the money." "You didn't?" "He never approached me," Robert said. "I think he prefers people who are already in some difficulty. It's easier." There was a grimness in this observation that she recognized, not anger exactly, but the particular tightness of someone who has watched injustice operate smoothly and efficiently for years and found no clean way to stop it. "What I don't understand," Hester said, "is what I'm supposed to do. I have no legal claim to that ranch. I was married to Dale for less than 2 months. Whatever rights a wife might theoretically have are unlikely to survive contact with a man like Creel who has a lawyer and no scruples." "That's probably true," Robert said, "but there are other considerations." He was quiet for a moment. "The land can be contested if the debt is disputed. If there's any irregularity in the original loan agreement, any breach of the terms on Creel's side, any evidence of fraud or usury — Montana Territory has laws against excessive interest rates — then Creel's claim to the property becomes harder to enforce." Hester stared at him. "You know something about land law?" "I had to," he said simply. "When my wife died, there was a dispute about the eastern boundary of this property. I spent 6 months learning more about land law than I ever wanted to know." A pause. "The letters you found, you read them. Every one. Do you remember the interest rate he quoted in the original agreement?" She did. She had a good memory. It had always been one of her more reliable assets, the ability to hold information precisely and retrieve it without distortion. She told him the rate. He was quiet for a moment, calculating. "That's above the territorial limit," he said. "Not by a dramatic amount, but enough." He looked at her. "If you had those letters—" "I don't," she said. "I left them. I didn't think to take them. I was thinking about surviving the night." He nodded. This was not a criticism. It was simply an acknowledgement of the reality. "They'll still be there," he said, "under the floor. Creel's men will go to the ranch." "Not immediately. In this snow, no one is moving for at least 2 days." He looked out the window at the white pressed glass. "After the storm, if we moved quickly, she said. He met her eyes again. "You came to my gate," he said. "I opened it." It was not a romantic statement. It was not a flowery declaration. It was simply the articulation of a position, a statement of the fact that he had made a choice, and he understood what that choice entailed, and he was not backing away from it. And it hit her with more force than any romantic statement she had ever received, because it was entirely real. She looked at the snow against the window. She looked at her hands around the coffee cup. She thought about the letters under the floorboard, about the interest rate that was above the territorial limit, about the lawyer in Harker's Bluff and the 4 or 5 men who did Creel's physical work. And she thought about a man who had spent 6 months learning land law after his wife died, who kept his hens in a coop attached to the barn so they wouldn't freeze, who built a fire first and asked questions second. "All right," she said. The 2 days of the storm were the strangest days Hester could remember. Not difficult. Exactly. Robert Alden's house was warm and solid and well-stocked, the kind of house maintained by someone who took preparation seriously, who had laid in enough wood and food and lamp oil to survive an extended isolation without drama. They were not uncomfortable. What they were was intensely close, the way any 2 people are when they are confined together by weather, when the world contracts to a handful of rooms and a fire, and every small thing becomes vivid and significant. She learned things about him in those 2 days that he did not tell her directly. He was not a man who narrated himself, but that she observed with the careful attention she had always brought to the project of understanding the people around her. He woke early, before full light, and was always already at his work when she came out of her room. He read in the evenings. He had 3 shelves of books in the main room, which surprised her, a real library for a ranch house, heavy on history and natural science, with a handful of novels that looked more worn than the others, read repeatedly. He was meticulous about certain things. The tools hung in the barn were organized precisely. The kitchen was kept in a specific order that she quickly learned to maintain without being told. But he was not controlling about it. He showed her where things went with the same matter-of-factness with which he did everything else, and when she asked questions, he answered them fully. He asked about her life in Illinois, once, on the evening of the first day, not intrusively but with a genuine curiosity that she was not prepared for. She had grown so accustomed to men who asked questions in order to position themselves rather than to actually learn anything. She told him about Illinois. About the pharmacist. Edward Hester had married at 22, when she had been grateful for the stability and had not yet understood what a life without warmth would cost her. She told him about the pharmacy and the customers and the particular gray rhythm of a life that was adequate but never more than that. She told him about learning to read medical texts because Edward's library was mostly medical, and she had been hungry for something to think about. She told him that she was a good reader, that she learned quickly, that she had a memory that held things precisely. He listened to all of this. He did not offer his own life in exchange, not yet, but she could see him listening with the attentiveness of a man who was taking her seriously, who was filing the information carefully, who was in some way revising his understanding of her with each thing she said. On the second evening, she asked him about his wife. There was a pause, not a painful one or not only painful, but the pause of someone who is deciding how much of a true thing to say. Her name was Clara, he said. She came from Ohio with me in 1877. She had a very specific idea of what she wanted, and Montana was not quite it, but she adapted. She was good at adapting. He was quiet for a moment. She died of typhoid fever in 1877, 4 months after we arrived. Another pause. We had not even finished building this house. Hester said, "I'm sorry. It was a long time ago. That doesn't necessarily make it a smaller thing." He looked at her, a quick, sharp look as though she had said something unexpected. "No," he agreed. "It doesn't." They were quiet for a while. The fire crackled. Outside, the snow had slowed to something gentle and sporadic, the storm exhausting itself, and through the window Hester could see the first stars appearing in a sky that was going from gray to very dark blue. "I finished the house anyway," he said eventually. "After she died. I didn't see any reason not to." This struck Hester as one of the most quietly gutting things she had ever heard, and also one of the most dignified. He had been left alone in an unfinished house in a territory that was barely settled, with no wife and no family nearby, and he had simply finished building the house, because the house needed to be finished, because it was the next thing and then the next, and then the one after that. "You've been alone here for 7 years, she said. "Mostly," he said. "That's a long time." "Yes," he said, and then, "It is." And something in the way he said it, not complaint, not plea, simply acknowledgement. A man allowing himself to recognize a thing that was true, made her chest ache with a warmth that had nothing to do with the fire. On the third morning, the sky was clear and brutal and blue. The snow settled and stiff and sparkling in a way that was beautiful and also, she knew, deceptive, because that kind of bright cold was some of the most dangerous there was. Robert was already out in the barn when she woke. When he came back in, his breath was clouds and his cheeks were dark with cold, and he said, without preamble, "The snow is firm enough to travel on. If we go today, we might get to the Boone ranch and back before nightfall." She felt the familiar tightening in her chest. "You're sure?" "No," he said, "but waiting makes it more likely someone else gets there first." She got her coat. They took his horse, a large, solid bay named General, who moved through the packed snow with the systematic confidence of an animal who had done this many times, and Robert drove the small wagon, while Hester sat beside him bundled in a blanket he'd pulled from the chest in the hall, and they made their way along the road toward the Boone ranch in the freezing, brilliant morning. It was strange to approach the ranch again. It had been less than 3 days since she had left, but it felt architecturally distant, like a place from a different chapter of her life. The house was cold. The fire had long since gone out, and it smelled of vacancy, which has its own particular smell, a combination of settled dust and absence. She went straight to the bedroom. She moved the hook rug. She found the loose board. She lifted it. The letters were there. All of them exactly as she'd left them, and she took them out and counted them to be sure 11 letters, and folded them carefully into the inside pocket of her coat, close to her body, where they would stay warm and safe, and where no one could get at them without getting at her first. Robert had gone through the rest of the house, quickly and methodically, checking for anything else of potential legal value: deeds, receipts, records. In a locked tin box in the kitchen cupboard, which he opened with a small knife he carried, they found something important: the original loan agreement between Dale Boone and Vernon Creel, handwritten on 2 pages, signed by both men with a witness signature from the lawyer Simmons. Hester read the interest rate. It matched what was in the letters, and it was definitively, clearly above the Montana Territory legal limit for private loans. "This is evidence," she said. "That's a word for it," Robert said. He took the document from her gently and looked at it himself. "This is usury. If we can get this to the right person, the sheriff in Caldwell Creek," Hester said. Robert was quiet for a moment. "Sheriff Totham is not Creel's man," he said, "but he's also not a man who goes looking for trouble with people who can make his life difficult. He'd need a reason to act. These documents are a reason. They're a start. We'd need someone to actually file a formal complaint, someone with standing." He looked at her. "You, as Dale's widow, have standing to contest the debt structure. A lawyer in the territorial capital, Helena, could file on your behalf." "I can't get to Helena," she said. "Not quickly." "No," he agreed. "But you don't have to. You need to file the initial complaint here with Totham, and then Totham forwards it to the county judge. The judge has to look at it before Creel can legally foreclose on the land." He paused. "It's not a guaranteed outcome, but it slows him down. It puts what he's doing on record. That matters." She looked at him. "How do you know all of this?" "I told you," he said. "The boundary dispute." A pause. "And I read," he added, with the faintest trace of something that in another person might have been dry humor. They left the ranch quickly before she could start to feel anything too complicated about it. On the drive back, the sky began to shift in the west, clouds building at the edge of the horizon with the particular purpose that meant more weather coming. They had perhaps 4 or 5 hours before the next system moved in. "We need to go to Totham today," she said. He looked at the sky. "Agreed." They went to Caldwell Creek before returning to the ranch. The town was small enough that every horse tied to a rail meant something, and Hester was conscious of being seen, of the woman at the general store window who watched them pass, of the 2 men outside the saloon who tracked the wagon with the idle focus of men with nothing better to do. She kept her face forward. She kept her hands still in her lap. Sheriff Totham was a man of 50-something with a gray beard, and the look of someone who had chosen a life of managed conflict, present enough to maintain order, removed enough to avoid getting personally involved in anything messy. He looked at Hester with the specific wariness of a man who was being asked to do something difficult and was calculating the cost. But he read the documents, and even he, with all his calibrated neutrality, could see what the interest rate said. "This is irregular," he said, which was a significant understatement. "It's usury under territorial law," Robert said. "Section 14 of the Montana Territory Lending Regulations, adopted in 1881. Totham looked at Robert with the expression of a man who would have preferred not to know that. He looked back at the documents. He looked at Hester. "You're filing a formal complaint," he said. It was not quite a question. "I am," she said. There was a long pause, the particular pause of a man weighing the discomfort of acting against the discomfort of having refused to act and having to live with that choice. Then he opened his desk drawer and took out a form. Hester sat very straight and answered every question clearly and precisely, because she had a good memory and she understood that this moment mattered, that the accuracy of what she said here would determine a great deal of what happened next. Robert sat beside her, quiet and steady. When it was done, Totham looked at the completed form with something she might have called reluctant respect. "This will go to Judge Hartley in the county," he said. "It'll take time, and Creel will know you filed." "I know," she said. "He'll send men." "I know that too." Totham looked at Robert. "You're involved in this." "I'm her neighbor," Robert said. There was a great deal packed into those 3 words, and Totham seemed to understand most of it. He nodded once, the nod of a man who has processed information and reached a position he will maintain without further discussion. They left the sheriff's office and stepped back into the cold. The clouds in the west had moved closer. the sky taking on the yellowed tint that preceded serious snowfall. They walked to the wagon and Robert helped her up, a brief practical gesture, his hand at her elbow, warm even through 2 layers of wool. "Thank you," she said, "for coming with me, for knowing about Section 14. He climbed up on his side and picked up the reins. "Section 14 came in useful," he said, and that trace of dry warmth again, just barely there, just enough to be real. She looked at him for a moment. The sky was doing remarkable things behind him, the light going amber and strange before the incoming gray, and he was looking at the road ahead, his jaw set, his profile clear and steady against that complicated sky. She thought, "I am in a great deal of trouble. I am possibly in more trouble now that Creel will know I filed than I was before. I am in a stranger's house with $43 and a carpet bag, and a legal process that may or may not resolve before someone comes to the door." And underneath all of that, underneath the fear and the pragmatism and the careful management of what needed to happen next, she was aware of something else, something that she identified with some alarm as the beginning of a feeling she had not expected to have again. Something that had to do with the way he had said, "You came to my gate. I opened it." She looked away from him. She looked at the road. They drove back to his ranch in a silence that was, she noted with some helplessness, no longer quite as neutral as it had been. Vernon Creel's man arrived on a Thursday. It had been 5 days since the filing. 5 days in which the routine of Robert Alden's ranch had folded Hester in with a naturalness that she found both comforting and slightly alarming, because it was becoming difficult to imagine the alternative. She had taken over the cooking, which she was better at than Robert and which he acknowledged freely, and in return he had shown her how to manage the wood stove in a way that got the most out of each piece, and they had fallen into a rhythm that felt, in the small morning hours before she thought about it too carefully, almost like something that had always existed. She had begun to read his books in the evenings, sitting on the other side of the fire while he went over his accounts or mended harness leather, and they talked about what she read. He had opinions about everything, quiet but specific, and he listened to her opinions with the same focused attention he brought to everything else, and she had begun to understand that a man who listened was rarer than anything she had previously understood. On the 5th evening she had asked him, "Do you miss having company?" "In general, I mean, before I came." He was quiet for a moment, the ledger in his hands. "I stopped thinking about it," he said, "which is not quite the same as not missing it." He looked up. "You ask very direct questions. You give very direct answers," she said. It seemed like the appropriate approach. Something shifted in his expression, not a smile exactly, but the precursor to one, the arrangement of the face that precedes the actual event. "That's fair," he said. "On the Thursday she was in the kitchen when she heard the sound of horses. More than one." She went still, and then she went to the window that faced the front of the house, and she saw 2 men on horseback at the gate, both strangers, both with the particular quality of men who have ridden somewhere for a purpose and are not planning to be pleasant about it. Robert was in the barn. She could see him moving through the barn window. She did not know if he had heard the horses yet. She made a decision in about 3 seconds. She went to the door and opened it and stepped onto the porch, which put her in their line of sight before they had fully decided how to approach, which gave her a small advantage of the kind that comes from refusing to be caught off guard. "Can I help you?" she said. The closer of the 2 men, heavyset, with a brown coat and the specific expression of someone who usually got his way through size, said, "We're looking for the widow Boone." "You found her," Hester said. The man looked at her with the particular calculation of a man who had expected more difficulty. "Mr. Creel sends his regards. He wants you to know that he's aware of the complaint you filed with the sheriff, and he invites you to reconsider your position. The land belongs to the debt. The debt is Mr. Creel's. This doesn't have to be complicated. The territorial court will determine what belongs to whom," Hester said. "That's what courts are for." "Mr. Creel is patient," the man said, in a tone that implied Creel's patience was not a comforting quality. but he wanted you to know that legal processes can be slow, and in the meantime, a woman alone on the frontier is in a precarious position. I'm not alone, Robert Alden said. He had come from the barn so quietly that the two men hadn't heard him, and he was standing now at the corner of the house, not aggressively positioned, not reaching for anything, simply present, a large, steady, unmovable presence with the particular stillness of a man who is not afraid of this moment. The heavy-set man looked at him. Robert looked back. "Mr. Alden," the man said, which meant he had been told who lived here, which meant Creel had done his preparation. "You've delivered your message," Robert said. "I'd suggest you ride back to Harker's Bluff and tell Creel that the complaint is filed. The documents are in the sheriff's custody, and Mrs. Boone has a neighbor who is paying attention." A pause. "And that further attempts to intimidate a widow on her way to a legal proceeding will be included in the court record." There was a silence. The two men exchanged a look. The heavy-set man looked back at Robert, doing the particular calculation of men who operate through intimidation when they encounter someone who is not intimidated. "We'll be back," he said. "I expect so," Robert said pleasantly. "Good afternoon." They rode away. Hester stood on the porch until they were out of sight, and then she let out a breath that she had not been aware she was holding, and she turned to find Robert watching her. "Are you all right?" he asked. "Yes," she said, and then, "You came out of the barn very quietly." "I heard the horses," he said. "I wanted to see how you'd handle it before I intervened." She stared at him, and, the near smile again. "Very well," he said. "You stood your ground and you gave them nothing to use." He paused. "But I didn't like the way the second man was looking at you." She hadn't particularly liked it either. The second man had been quiet throughout the exchange, which was its own kind of warning. Men who stay quiet in those situations are usually calculating rather than hesitating. "Do you think they'll come back before the court process resolves?" she asked. "Yes," he said simply. "But the court process may not take as long as they're expecting. I sent a letter to Helena 3 days ago." She stared at him again. "You sent a letter to Helena?" "To a lawyer I know there, who has successfully prosecuted usury cases before. I described the situation. I included copies of the key figures from the loan agreement. I wrote them down from memory before we left the ranch." He looked at her steadily. "He should have it by now. He'll know whether there's a faster avenue than waiting for the county judge." Hester stood on the porch in the cold, looking at this man, and felt something she could only describe as a kind of structural shift in her understanding of herself, a recalibration. Because she had been managing her own crises alone for so long, had been so practiced at the solitary navigation of difficult situations, that the idea of someone simply taking action on her behalf quietly, without announcement, without requiring anything from her in return, was almost more than she could process. "You did that 3 days ago," she said. "The day after we filed with Totham," he said. "You didn't tell me. I wasn't sure it would come to anything." He paused. "I didn't want to give you hope about something I wasn't certain of." She looked at him for a long moment. The cold pressed against the back of her neck. The afternoon light was going golden and low, the way it did in Montana in December, spending itself lavishly for about 40 minutes before giving up entirely. "Robert," she said, and it was the first time she had used his first name, and she felt him register it, a small, still moment, like a stone dropping into water and the ripple just beginning to spread. "Yes," he said. "Why are you doing this?" It was the question she had been trying not to ask, because she knew that asking it opened a door that she was not entirely sure she was prepared to walk through. But the two men on horseback had reminded her that time was not a luxury she had, that the space for cautious avoidance was narrowing with every day. He was quiet for what felt like a long time. He looked at the space between them on the porch, and then he looked at the horizon, the line where the golden light was giving way to the early dark. "Because you came to my gate," he said, "and you were in trouble and you didn't lie to me about what kind of trouble it was." He paused. "And because," he stopped. "Because," she said quietly. He looked at her. "Because I haven't talked to anyone the way I talked to you in a very long time," he said, And I find that I'm not inclined to stop. She held that. She held it carefully, the way you hold something that is fragile and also warm, the way you hold something that you don't want to drop. Neither am I, she said. They stood on the porch in the declining December light, not touching, not moving, with the particular charged stillness of two people who have said something true and are deciding what to do with it. And then the cold made the decision for them. Robert said, "We should go in," and she agreed, and they went inside and she made dinner while he fed the animals, and they ate together at the kitchen table, and the conversation was about ordinary things, the state of his cattle, whether the south pasture fence would hold through another major snow, the letter from Helena and what the lawyer might say, but underneath the ordinary things was something else. Something that had not been there before or had been there, and was now simply no longer hidden, and it changed the texture of the evening in a way that was both alarming and deeply, fundamentally good. The letter from the Helena lawyer arrived 9 days later, carried by the post rider who made his rounds regardless of weather, the kind of dedicated route keeper who understood that Montana's distances meant that communication was not a convenience but a lifeline. His name, the lawyer, was James Carmody, and his letter was 4 pages long and extremely clear. He had reviewed the figures Robert had provided. The interest rate was in violation of the 1881 Territorial Lending Act. Furthermore, and this was the part that made Hester's breath catch, he had found in the public records in Helena 3 previous usury complaints against Vernon Creel that had each been quietly withdrawn before reaching the court. The withdrawals had occurred under circumstances that Carmody described as suspicious, which Hester understood to mean that Creel had leaned on the complainants until they stopped complaining. But the existence of 3 previous complaints, even withdrawn ones, was a pattern. And a pattern, Carmody wrote, was something that a territorial judge could not easily ignore, particularly when combined with a 4th complaint that included a copy of the original loan agreement and was filed by a widow with legitimate standing. He was prepared to travel to the county seat and argue the case himself for a fee of $40, which he acknowledged was below his usual rate, but which he said he was willing to accept given the public interest nature of the matter. "He'll take the $40, Robert said, when Hester finished reading the letter aloud. "I have 43, she said. "Then you have $3 left after," he said, "and we write back today." She wrote the letter. He provided the $40, which she told him she would repay when the legal matter resolved, and he said that was fine, and neither of them made anything of it except what it was, a practical arrangement between people who had each decided to trust the other. The hearing was set for 2 weeks out in the county seat at Millville, 12 miles east of Caldwell Creek. Carmody arrived the day before, a small, energetic man of about 50 with quick eyes and a battered leather case that appeared to contain half a law library, and he sat at Robert's kitchen table for 2 hours going over everything with Hester while Robert sat at the other end of the table and occasionally answered questions about the territorial land records. "You know a great deal about territorial law for a rancher," Carmody observed. "I had a boundary dispute," Robert said. "Evidently a comprehensive one," Carmody said, and looked at him with an expression that suggested he had revised his initial assessment of Robert Alden in a favorable direction. The night before the hearing, Creel's men came back. 3 of them this time in the dark, and Hester woke to the sound of horses and Robert's voice carrying from outside, firm and completely unafraid, and she went to the window and saw him standing at the gate with the lantern, and she saw the 3 men on horseback, and she saw the conversation that was happening in the dark, and she could not hear it but she could see in the posture of the men, the way they eventually pulled back, the way they did not dismount, the way they turned and went. That whatever Robert had said had been sufficient. He came back inside and she was standing in the hallway. "What did you tell them?" she asked. "That the hearing is tomorrow," he said. "That Carmody's case is solid. That any interference with a witness or a complainant in an active legal matter is a criminal offense that would significantly complicate whatever Creel is hoping to accomplish. He set the lantern on the table, and that I had already written a second letter to Helena, this one to the territorial marshal's office, describing the intimidation attempts in specific detail. She stared at him. "Did you?" "Yes," he said. "That one I sent 4 days ago." He looked at her. "Are you all right?" She was more than all right. She was standing in the hallway of a man's house at 11 o'clock at night with her hair loose and her shawl over her nightgown, and the crisis that had been building for weeks was coming to a head, and she was not afraid. She was not, she realized, afraid. And she could not entirely account for this, except in terms of the man standing in front of her with the lantern light catching the gray-green of his eyes. "Robert," she said. "Hester," he said. And she crossed the few feet between them and put her hand on his chest, over his heart, and felt it steady, strong, slightly faster than usual, which meant she was not the only one who was feeling this particular thing at this particular moment. And he looked at her hand and then at her face, and what she saw in his face was not hunger, not urgency, but something that went deeper than both of those things, something that looked like recognition, like relief. Like the expression of a man who has been waiting for something without knowing quite what it was and has suddenly understood. He put his hand over hers. That was all. His hand over hers, both of them standing in the hallway, the lantern light wavering gently. "We should sleep," he said. "Tomorrow is important." "Yes," she agreed. But neither of them moved for another moment, and the warmth that spread from that point of contact, his hand over hers, her hand against his heart, was different from the warmth of any fire she had ever sat beside. It was internal, cellular, the kind of warmth that does not depend on proximity to a heat source, but that generates itself from within, from the meeting of two particular people in exactly this particular moment. Then she stepped back. He let her go. She went to her room and he went to his, and the house was quiet and warm, and she lay in the dark with her hand still holding the feeling of his hand and thought, whatever tomorrow brings, this is real. The hearing took 2 hours. Carmody was, as his battered case suggested, formidable. He presented the original loan agreement, the interest rate comparison to the territorial statute, and the pattern of 3 previous complaints sourced from the public record, and therefore unimpeachable, with the crisp efficiency of someone who had done this before and knew exactly where the weight of the argument lay. Creel's lawyer Simmons, who had made the trip from Harker's Bluff, and who appeared to have anticipated a much simpler proceeding, found himself in the uncomfortable position of a man who had brought a knife to an argument that required a much more elaborate instrument. Judge Hartley, a deliberate man in his 60s who had been on the circuit long enough to know when a case had teeth, asked pointed questions and took extensive notes. He looked at the loan agreement for a long time. He looked at the interest rate. He looked at the 3 previous complaints. He looked at Hester, who sat very straight and answered every question clearly and precisely, the way she had answered Totem's questions, because she had a good memory and she understood that accuracy mattered. In the end, Judge Hartley ruled that the loan agreement was void under territorial usury law, that the debt could not legally attach to the land, and that Vernon Creel had no legal claim to the Boone property. He further referred the matter of the previous complaints and the pattern of behavior to the territorial marshal's office, which was the referral that Robert had set in motion 2 weeks ago. Hester sat very still when the ruling came. She was aware of Carmody exhaling beside her. She was aware of Creel's lawyer gathering his papers with tight, controlled movements. She was aware of Robert, who had been sitting 2 rows behind her, and the particular quality of his stillness, which was the stillness of a man who has maintained a position under pressure for a long time and is now allowing himself to let the pressure go. She turned to look at him. He was already looking at her. Outside the courthouse, in the cold December air, Carmody shook her hand and said he hoped the matter was resolved to her satisfaction, and that she should not hesitate to contact him if Creel attempted any further action. She thanked him. She paid him the $40, which he received with professional dignity. He got in the hired buggy he'd come in and went back toward Millville to catch the stage. She stood outside the courthouse with Robert Alden. The sky above them was the deep, clear blue of a Montana winter afternoon, the kind of blue that looks like it should be cold, but carries a particular thin warmth in its lower reaches. The street around them was ordinary, a wagon going past, a woman with a market basket, 2 horses at the rail, the ordinary business of a small town continuing regardless of the legal determinations being made inside its courthouse. "What do you want to do?" Robert asked. "About the ranch." She had been thinking about this. She had been thinking about it since the moment Carmody's letter had arrived, and she understood that there was a realistic chance the legal matter would resolve in her favor. She had a ranch. She had land. She had cattle, assuming Creel's men hadn't done anything to the herd in the past weeks, which was a reasonable concern that Carmody had said they could address if necessary. She had a life that she had built nothing in and could now potentially build something in. She thought about what she wanted. "I don't know that I want to ranch it myself," she said. "Not alone. I don't have the knowledge or the labor for it." She paused. "But I could sell it. Or lease it." "Or," Robert said and then stopped. "Or," she said. He looked at the street. He looked at his hands. He looked, for the first time in her experience of him, like a man who was genuinely uncertain, not about a practical matter, but about something personal, about the right words for something he wanted to say correctly. "Or," he said more slowly, "if you were willing to stay in this part of the territory, and I recognize that you have no particular reason to, that you could go anywhere now, that the $43 and whatever you get for the ranch is a real option. But if you were willing to stay," he stopped again. "Robert," she said gently. He looked at her. "I am not good at this," he said. "I have not had occasion to practice it in a long time." "You're doing fine," she said. "What I want to say," he said, with the deliberateness of a man building something carefully, making sure each piece is placed correctly before adding the next, "is that I would like you to stay. Not because you have nowhere else to go, you do, and I want you to know that I understand that, but because I want you to stay. Because the house has been, because I—" He stopped a third time, and then, with the expression of someone who has decided that the carefully assembled words are not working, and the direct approach is the only remaining option, he said, "I don't want you to leave." Hester looked at him in the cold, clear December air of Millville, Montana territory, in the year 1884. She thought about the gate in the dark. She thought about the fire he built without asking questions. She thought about Section 14 of the Territorial Lending Act, and the letter to Helena, and his hand over hers in the hallway at 11 o'clock at night. She thought about what it was to be truly heard by another person, to be taken seriously, to have someone act on your behalf not from obligation or expectation, but from the simple, unadorned fact of choosing to. She thought, "I have been in one airless room and then another. I have been surviving carefully and competently for 31 years. I have never once been in a place that felt like it was actually mine, with a person who was actually present. I don't want to leave either," she said. The near smile became an actual smile. She had not seen a full smile from him before, and it was remarkable. It transformed his face, removed 7 years of solitary weight from it, made him look younger and warmer and more like the version of himself that had perhaps existed before he finished a house alone in a new territory with his wife 4 months in the ground. He reached out and took her hand, and she gave it to him, and they stood there on the street in Millville, holding hands like 2 ordinary people who had simply found each other, while the world went about its business around them. They were married in March. It was a small ceremony, which suited both of them. The minister was a young man named Pastor Cole, who had arrived in Caldwell Creek in January, and who had the eagerness of someone who had not yet had the frontier knock the corners off him, but who was genuinely kind. Hollies from the general store came, and me from the laundry, and a rancher named Patterson from the east side of the creek, who had been one of the men Creel had unsuccessfully approached 3 years ago, and who had come to have a significant respect for Robert Alden. Carmody sent a letter of congratulations from Helena that arrived the day before the wedding, which Hester pinned to the wall in the kitchen and which made Robert, when he read it, produce that full smile again. The Boone Ranch had been leased to a young couple from Iowa named Howell, who were newly arrived and wanted land and had enough practical energy between them to make it work. The lease gave Hester an income that was modest but reliable, and she had used it, combined with what she had from the sale of some of the cattle, to contribute to the improvements on Robert's ranch, their ranch now, that they had been planning since January. The first improvement was a proper library wall in the main room, because she had more books coming from Illinois. A crate of them she'd had a friend ship west, and Robert's 3 shelves were already overfull. The second was a larger kitchen, because she had plans for the kitchen that the existing one could not accommodate. The third was discussed in February, on an evening when the fire was burning and the snow was falling outside, and they were sitting together on the bench at the kitchen table with Robert's arm around her shoulders and her head resting against him, and he had said, "There's a room we don't use." She had looked up at him. "The one adjacent to the library," he said. She was quiet for a moment, because she understood what he was saying, and it required a moment to process the fullness of it, the warmth of it, the particular kind of hope it represented. "We should think about what to do with it," she said. "I was thinking a nursery," he said, and then looked at her with the particular expression of a man who has said something that could easily go wrong and is watching carefully to see if it does. She put her hand on his chest, the way she had in the hallway in December. "I think that's a very good idea," she said. The wedding was on a Saturday. The weather was still cold but had the particular early spring quality that gives you hints, a softening in the air, the first suggestion of mud beneath the snow, a quality of light that carries a promise it hasn't quite yet fulfilled but that you trust, looking at it, will eventually deliver. Hester wore the navy blue wool dress, which was still her best, and she would not have traded it for silk because it was the dress she had worn when she arrived at Robert Alden's gate, and it felt correct to be married in it. They stood in front of Pastor Cole in the main room of the ranch house, with the fire going and 5 people around them who were, in various ways, genuine well-wishers rather than ceremonial ones. And they said the old words, the words that have been said for centuries because they are, for all their age, still the most precise available articulation of the thing they describe. And when Robert slid the ring onto her finger, a simple gold band he had ordered from the jeweler in Millville, and which fit as though it had always belonged there, she felt something she could only describe as rightness. Not the relief of a problem solved, not the satisfaction of a plan successfully executed, but a quieter and more fundamental thing, the sense of having arrived somewhere real. After the ceremony, Me had brought food, a remarkable quantity of it, more than 5 people could reasonably eat, which was its own kind of gift, and they ate and talked, and it was the most social the ranch house had been in 7 years. And Robert moved through it with an ease that suggested the isolation had perhaps not suited him as naturally as he had taught himself to believe. When everyone had gone and the dishes were done and the fire was banked for the night, they stood together in the main room, husband and wife, and it was quiet in the particular way that is not empty but full, the way quiet gets when the right people are sharing it. "Well," Hester said. "Well," Robert agreed, and there was that smile, settled in and permanent-looking, as though it had finally found a face it wanted to stay on. She put her arms around him. He put his around her. They stood in the middle of the room that he had finished building alone 7 years ago, that she had walked 4 miles in the dark to reach, that was now theirs, completely, genuinely, irrevocably theirs. Spring came properly in late April, and with it the particular business of a ranch moving into its productive season. The cattle needed to be assessed after the winter. The south fence that Robert had been concerned about needed repair. The kitchen garden had to be turned and planted. The hens were laying with the cheerful excess of animals responding to longer days. Hester threw herself into all of it with a complete willingness that surprised even herself. She had not expected to love ranch work, had expected to merely do it competently, but there was something about the physical work of this specific place, this specific land, with this specific man working alongside her, that made it feel entirely different from obligation. She learned to ride properly. She had a basic competency from childhood but nothing more, and Robert taught her with the same patient, matter-of-fact approach he brought to everything. And by June she could take General out alone and check the north pasture, which he said was high praise in the form of trust. They talked constantly. This was perhaps the thing that surprised her most, because she had expected a quiet life. Robert was quiet, had been quiet for years, and she had assumed that was his baseline. But it turned out that what he had been was quiet in the absence of someone who genuinely engaged with what he was thinking, and with Hester present, there was apparently a great deal he had been saving up to say. He had opinions about history and about cattle breeding and about the territorial politics and about the books they both read, and they went back and forth on all of it and disagreed sometimes. She thought his assessment of a particular novel they read in May was completely wrong and said so, and he defended his position. And they spent an entire evening arguing about it with the fire going and the windows dark, and the particular pleasure of two people who find that even disagreement is a form of intimacy. In July, she told him she was expecting their child. He was in the barn when she told him, because she had walked out to find him rather than waiting, because she was not, she had discovered, a woman who waited well for important things. He was mending a piece of harness and he looked up when she came in, and she told him simply and directly, because those were the terms on which they had always operated with each other. And he set the harness down very carefully on the workbench and stood up and crossed to her and took her face in his hands and looked at her with an expression that had no word for it, but that contained things she had not known she was waiting to see on a person's face when they looked at her. "Are you well?" he asked. "Very," she said. He kissed her. It was not their first kiss that had been months ago, in April, on the porch in the thin early spring sun, one of those kisses that are long anticipated and somehow still a surprise when they happen, but this one was different. This one was the kind of kiss that accumulates everything that has happened and holds it all at once. They turned the room adjacent to the library into a nursery over the course of August and September, the project taking on a pleasurable urgency as autumn arrived and Hester's body changed, and the reality of the approaching child became vivid and specific rather than abstract and theoretical. Robert built the cradle himself, from pine, working on it in the evenings with the focused patience of someone making something that matters. Hester made the quilt her first, and not as accomplished as the one made by Robert's mother that was still on the spare room bed, but made with a care that she felt the child would somehow understand when the time came to tell this story. Me from the laundry, who had become a genuine friend over the months, came to help as the time drew near, and said she had attended more births than she could count and that Hester had good bones for it, which was Me's way of being reassuring and which was, in fact, reassuring. The doctor from Caldwell Creek, a man named Briggs who was young and serious and good at his work, was the other person Hester had decided she trusted, which was a short list and one she had built carefully. Their son was born on the 23rd of November, 1885, almost exactly a year after Hester had walked 4 miles in the dark with $43 and a carpetbag full of secrets. Robert was beside her through all of it, which was not typical. Most men waited outside. But Hester had told him she wanted him there, and he had been there completely, with the same unflinching steadiness he brought to every difficulty, holding her hand with the specific grip of a man who was not going to let go. When the baby arrived and Briggs said, "It's a boy," Robert looked at his son with an expression so stripped of any performance, so nakedly genuine, that Hester, already exhausted and overwhelmed and flooded with a feeling so large it had no proper name, burst into tears that were entirely of the good kind. They named him Thomas James Alden. Thomas for no specific reason except that it felt right, solid, and honest, the kind of name a person could carry with dignity. James for Carmody, the Helena lawyer who had fought the case that had made all of this possible, because Hester felt that justice deserved to be honored, and that naming a child was one way to honor it. Thomas was a serious baby in his first months. He had his father's quality of watchful attentiveness, the sense of a person who is absorbing more than he is showing, and then gradually revealed a personality that had his mother's directness, a baby who communicated his needs with remarkable clarity, and who, by the time he was crawling, was approaching every corner of the house with the systematic curiosity of someone conducting an investigation. Robert, who had lived alone for 7 years in the house he had finished building alone, who had maintained the quietness of that solitude with the discipline of someone who had no alternative, turned out to be a man of extraordinary patience with a small child. He carried Thomas on his shoulders through the barn, naming every animal, describing every tool and process with the serious thoroughness he brought to all instruction. He read to him in the evenings, from books that Thomas was far too young to comprehend, but seemed to enjoy for the sound of his father's voice. He built Thomas a small wooden horse during the winter of 1885 into 1886, working on it in the same evenings he had worked on the cradle, and presented it in the spring with a formality that was genuinely touching. The winter of 1885 also brought a resolution to the last remaining thread of the Creel matter. The Territorial Marshal's Office, acting on the referral from Judge Hartley and the documentation Robert had sent the previous December, had investigated Vernon Creel's lending practices over the preceding months. In December of 1885, Creel was indicted on 3 counts of criminal usury and 1 count of intimidating a legal complainant, the latter relating to his previous withdrawn cases, all 3 complainants having come forward once it was clear that the pattern was being officially recognized. Carmody wrote to tell Hester. His letter was precise and professional and contained, at the very end, a single line that read, "I hope you are both well and that Montana is proving as amenable as it seemed likely to be." She read this to Robert at the kitchen table and he said, "Carmody approved of you from the start," and she said, "He approved of you actually," and Robert said, "He approved of your legal instincts, which are considerable," and she said, "I learned from a man who knows Section 14 of the Territorial Lending Act by heart," and he laughed a full, warm laugh, the kind he had been slowly recovering the ability to produce, and it was one of her favorite sounds in the world. Creel was convicted the following spring. He did not go to prison. The territorial system was imperfect, and Simmons the lawyer was skilled. But he was stripped of his ability to engage in any lending activity in Montana territory, and was assessed a fine that consumed most of what he had accumulated through his usurious practices, which was redistributed partially to his previous victims through a process that was neither quick nor entirely fair, but that was better than nothing. The Howell family's lease on the Boone Ranch was converted, with Hester's agreement and the help of a straightforward legal process that Carmody handled from Helena, into a purchase, at a fair price that gave Hester and Robert a financial stability that removed the last of the tension from their first year. The eastern boundary of the ranch, Robert's old disputed boundary, had been settled legally years before, but the neighboring rancher, a man named Guthrie who had been the source of the original dispute, had retired and sold his property in the spring of 1886 to a family named Reese, who were from Minnesota and who had a directness of character that made them immediately compatible neighbors. The Reese family had 3 children and a large dog named Senator, and their arrival was the beginning of what would become, over the next several years, a social world that bore no resemblance to the isolation Robert had maintained for the 7 years before Hester came to his gate. It happened gradually, the way all real things happen, not with a dramatic announcement, but with an accumulation of small moments. A shared fence repair with Jim Reese that turned into a 2-hour conversation. Me's friendship with Hester, which deepened over visits and helped and exchanged recipes. The gradual return of Robert's willingness to be in the world, which Hester observed with a quiet joy that she tried not to make self-congratulatory about, because it was not her accomplishment, it was his, the slow reopening of a man who had been necessary to close for a while. In the summer of 1887, Thomas was almost 2, and had developed the firm conviction that the chickens were his personal responsibility, which the chickens appeared to accept with varying degrees of enthusiasm. He called them all Bird, regardless of which specific bird they were, and he kept the general store owner Hollies updated on their activities whenever Hester brought him to town, which Hollies received with a gravity that Thomas found appropriate and satisfying. Hester was in the kitchen garden on a Tuesday afternoon in July when she realized she was expecting again. She sat down on the garden bench they had built the previous spring and considered this information with the thoughtful attention she brought to everything, and then she considered how she felt about it, which turned out to be unambiguously happy. Not just practically satisfied. Genuinely, completely happy in a way that felt almost extravagant. She went to find Robert. He was in the barn, because he was almost always in the barn in the afternoons, which she found reliable and comforting rather than predictable in any limiting way. She told him. He received it with the same open expression he had the first time, though this time there was no looking at her hands, no wondering if she was well. He knew she was well. He knew her thoroughly by now, knew her wellness and her difficulty and her particular brand of humor, and the way she looked when she was reading something that absorbed her versus something she was merely reading for information, knew that she slept on her left side, and that she was a better baker than she was a cook, though she was also a good cook, and that she was precise with money and generous with time, and that she had a core of iron that she kept covered with the same ordinary daily life that conceals everyone's core from casual observation. He kissed her in the barn with the smell of hay and horses around them, and Thomas came toddling in from where he had been releasing chickens and found his parents kissing and said "Mama" with the tone of someone registering an event without quite knowing what to do with it, and they both laughed, which was the appropriate response. Their daughter was born in February of 1888, and they named her Clara. Robert had not suggested it. Hester had suggested it, carefully, one evening in the autumn of 1887, saying that she had been thinking about names and that she thought Clara was a name that deserved to be carried forward, that deserved to exist in this house, that the woman who had come to Montana with so much trust and so little time deserved to be remembered in the best way available to them. Robert had been very still when she said it. And then he had said, yes, with the simple completeness of a single word carrying a great deal more than its syllable. Clara was not a serious baby. She was emphatic and sunny, and had from the first weeks a quality of joyful insistence that made everyone around her feel pleasantly obligated to match her energy. Thomas, who had been uncertain about the arrival of a sibling for approximately 2 days, declared himself her appointed guardian on the 3rd day, and took the role extremely seriously, which mostly meant sitting beside her and explaining things to her in his father's manner of thorough and patient instruction. It was in the spring of 1888, when Clara was 3 months old and Thomas was 2.5 and the ranch was heading into its 3rd season of solid, well-run productivity, that Hester sat on the porch one afternoon. One of the first real spring afternoons, the ground soft with melt, the light different in the way of a world coming back to itself, and considered where she was and how she had come to be there. She had walked 4 miles in the dark and the cold with $43 and a carpetbag and a secret that could have gotten her killed, and she had arrived at a gate she couldn't open for 3 minutes because the latch was frozen solid, And when the door had opened, the man inside had not asked questions and had built a fire. That was the whole of it in one way. That was the smallest possible version of the story. Gate, door, fire. But it was also, in the way that small things are always the large things in compressed form, so much more than that. It was two people choosing each other in the dark, without adequate information, without guarantees, without anything but the stubborn insistence of their own natures that this was the right direction to move in. It was trust built from nothing, extended without certainty, justified by nothing except itself. It was a man who knew Section 14 of the Territorial Lending Act and wrote letters to Helena, and stood at his gate in the dark to send armed men away, all without ever once making her feel that she owed him anything for it, because he was not doing it to create a debt. He was doing it because she was real to him, because she mattered, because he had decided, at some point between the opening of the door and the building of the fire, that this woman was his person, and he was going to act accordingly. She heard him coming from the barn, Thomas on his shoulders, Thomas, who had recently decided that his preferred mode of transportation was his father's shoulders, and who Robert accommodated with the patient strength of a man who understands that some phases are brief and should be enjoyed. And the sight of them, coming across the yard in the spring light with the mountains behind them and the sound of Clara from inside the house where Mee was sitting with her, filled Hester's chest with something so full and specific that she sat very still to hold it properly. Robert looked up and saw her on the porch and raised a hand, a simple gesture, a greeting, the gesture of a man who is glad to see the person he is looking at. She raised her hand back. He came up the porch steps, and Thomas launched himself from his shoulders to the porch railing to the floor with the reckless confidence of a 2-year-old who has not yet had a bad outcome and who therefore genuinely believes in his own invincibility, and then disappeared through the door to investigate Clara and me. Robert sat down in the chair beside Hester, the 2 chairs they had placed on the porch in the spring of 1886 and that had been there ever since, the chairs they sat in on evenings when the weather allowed, when they talked and read and watched the light go down over the mountains in the particular extravagance of Montana evenings. "Good afternoon," he said. "Good afternoon," she said. He looked at her. She looked at him. There was, between them, the comfortable intimacy of people who have shared a life, the familiar landscape of each other's faces, the ease of presence that does not require explanation or management. "What are you thinking about?" He asked because he still asked, because he had always asked, because even now when he knew her well he understood that knowing a person does not mean you have already heard everything they think. She looked at the yard. She looked at the mountains. She looked at the gate at the far end of the property, the gate with the iron latch that froze in the cold, the gate she had stood at for 3 minutes on the coldest night of the year. "That night," she said, "in December, 4 years ago." He was quiet for a moment. "The coldest night of the year," he said. "You don't know how long I stood at that gate," she said. "The latch was frozen. I couldn't get it open." He looked at her with a kind of gentle surprise. "You never told me that." "I know," she said. "It didn't seem important at the time. There were more pressing things." She paused. "But I keep thinking about it. 3 minutes, maybe 4, in the dark and the cold, trying to get that latch open, wondering if I'd made a terrible mistake coming here, wondering if the decision I'd made based on 6 words from a woman at a laundry was the kind of decision a sensible person made." "6 words," he said. "He does not turn people away," she said. He was quiet for a moment. He looked at the gate. He looked back at her. "Me said that," he said. "Me said that," she confirmed. He absorbed this with the expression of someone who has received information that reframes a story he thought he knew. "I'll have to thank her properly," he said. "She brought enough food for 20 people at the wedding," Hester said. "I think she considers it repaid." They sat in the spring afternoon in the 2 chairs on the porch, while inside the house their children were supervised by a woman who had once said 6 words that turned out to be the most consequential navigation instruction Hester had ever received. "I'm glad you got the latch open," Robert said. "I'm glad you built the fire," she said. he reached over and took her hand. She gave it to him, the way she always did, easily and completely, with no uncertainty or reservation, with the specific confidence of someone who has handed this particular thing to this particular person many times and knows with absolute certainty that it is safe. They sat together as the spring afternoon worked itself toward evening, the mountains going through their sequence of colors, gold to copper to that brief, incredible pink that lasted only a few minutes, but that you remembered all winter, and the ranch settled around them with the sounds of a working day coming to its close, the cattle in the south pasture, the hens commenting from their coop, the particular evening wind that came down from the high ground and moved through the new grass with the sound of something beginning. Thomas appeared at the door demanding to know when dinner would happen, and Hester told him soon, and he considered this answer for a moment and then accepted it and went back inside, his footsteps retreating toward the sound of his sister, and Robert was already beginning to stand, because there were things to be done before dark, and he was a man who did the things that needed doing, quietly and well, without drama or complaint, because that was simply who he was. He stood and she stood, and they went inside together, into the warm and living house, into the life they had made from nothing, from a frozen gate and a fire and $43, and the trust of two people who had decided, in the dark, to move toward rather than away. And the door closed behind them on the spring evening, on the mountains, on the gate at the end of the path, and the light in the window of the house was the warm and steady light of a place where someone is always home. Thomas grew up to be a precise and thoughtful young man who loved history and cattle equally, and who, at the age of 17, won a county debate competition arguing in favor of improved labor protections for ranch workers, which his father received with the expression of a man who is deeply proud and slightly concerned in equal measure. Clara became the kind of child and then young woman who could talk to anyone. She had her mother's directness and her father's deep attention combined, which was a remarkable tool, and she used it with a generosity of spirit that made people feel, consistently, that they had been genuinely seen. Me attended every important occasion of the Alden family's life for the next 15 years, until she moved to Helena to live with her daughter's family, and at her going-away gathering at the Reese farm she told Hester in her direct and quiet way that she had known what she was doing when she said those 6 words. "You knew about Robert Alden," Hester said. "I knew what kind of man he was," Me said simply. "I also knew what kind of woman you were." A pause. "The rest was your business." Carmody visited once, in the summer of 1889, making a circuit of several cases in the territory, and stopping in Caldwell Creek with the air of a man who wanted to see how a particular story had turned out. He sat at the kitchen table in the Alden house and drank coffee and watched Thomas instruct Clara on the specific behavior of chickens and said, to no one in particular, "I have always felt that the best legal victories are the ones that end like this." Robert, who was at the other end of the table with the account book, looked up and said, "Like what?" "Loudly," Carmody said, as Thomas raised his voice to explain something to Clara with increased emphasis, and everyone in the kitchen laughed, and outside the window the Montana summer was doing its best work, the sky enormous and blue, the land extending in every direction with the generous indifference of something that has been here since before any of them arrived and will be here long after they are gone, which is not a sad thought but an orienting one. A reminder that the small and the large are both real. That the gate and the fire and the frozen latch and the $43 are real. That love built from a practical decision in the dark is as real as any other kind and perhaps more durable because it has been tested from the beginning, because it has never been under any illusion about what it is. On the last day of November every year, Hester Alden walked to the gate at the far end of the property. She did not make a ceremony of it. She simply walked there, in whatever the weather happened to be, and stood at the gate for a few minutes, and then walked back. She had done it every year since 1885, on the anniversary of the night she had arrived. Robert knew she did it. He had never asked her about it, though he was aware of it the way he was aware of all her habits and patterns, with the quiet completeness of a man who pays attention. One year it was 1890, she thought, or perhaps 1891. She walked to the gate in the late afternoon and found him already there, leaning on the fence post beside it, his hands in his coat pockets, looking out at the road. She stopped a few feet away and looked at him. "You're early," she said. "I came to fix the latch," he said. "It sticks in the cold." She looked at the latch. He had in fact been working on it. There was a cloth and a small tin of grease on the fence post beside him, and the latch was cleaner than it had been, its moving parts attended to. "You could have done that any time," she said. "Yes," he agreed. He looked at her. "I wanted to do it today." She understood. She understood that this was his way of being present with her in the particular way of this particular anniversary. Not by making a speech, not by offering a grand articulation of what this day meant to both of them, but by being here, by tending to the thing that had kept her out in the cold for 3 minutes 4 years ago, or 7 years ago now, or however long it had been, by making sure that the next time anyone came to this gate in difficulty the latch would open easily, readily. As though it had been waiting, she went to stand beside him. They looked at the road together, the road she had walked in the dark, in the snow, in the cold that put ice in the lungs and made the trees crack like rifle shots. "It's not as cold tonight," she said. "Not nearly," he said. "Still cold." "Montana," he said, which covered it completely. She leaned against him, her shoulder against his arm, and he put his arm around her. And they stood at the gate together in the last light of the last day of November, with the mountains going dark against a sky that still held a narrow strip of red at the horizon, and the house behind them warm and lit, and inside the house, Thomas and Clara and the life that had come from a frozen latch and a stranger's door and a fire built without questions. She had walked 4 miles in the dark, and she had arrived somewhere real. That was the whole of it, and it was everything.